You have joined us as we continue a stellar lineup at the Donald Blake Center. It's going to be a wonderful evening. We know that some of you probably, if you missed the person outside, just make sure you can check in so you can get your community credit before you go. But we're really glad you're here. If you're on the side, I do see there are some seats available. So if you want to just wave a hand if you have a free seat, that might be helpful for those who are sitting and may prefer to sit in a chair and not on a stair. Okay, I see a few in this corner. Okay, well, again, welcome. We hope this will be an engaging evening together, and that as the presentation is given, you engage your critical thinking and you have some questions that will be shared at the end of the presentation. But before our speaker for this evening, I believe we have an introduction.
Excuse me. Good evening, everyone. Tonight I have the privilege of introducing Frank Abe. Frank Abe is lead author of graphic novel We Hereby Refuse, Japanese American Resistance to Wartime Incarceration, which was named a finalist in creative nonfiction for the Washington State Book Award. He wrote, produced, and directed the award-winning PBS documentary Conscience and the Constitution on the largest organized resistance to the camps. As a winner of an American Book Award for co-editing John Ikeda, the life and rediscovered work of the author of No No Boy, he authored the first ever biography of Ikeda and traced the origins of his novel. He is currently co-editing the Penguin Book of the Literature of Japanese American Incarceration. Today he presents to us We Hereby Refuse, Japanese American Resistance to Wartime Incarceration, which touches on America's past and how it connects to our present. Please join your hands with me in welcoming Frank Abe.
Thank you very much, Stella. And we talked about everything except how to pronounce my last name, which is Frank Abe. So just so everyone knows in referring to me. I'm glad to be here tonight as part of the Donald Blake Center academic conference because the theme really aligns with what I hope to share with you, some stories tonight. As the poster says, race and belonging, Asian American experience in the Pacific Northwest. My subject is about race and belonging and how the question of one's race determined whether you belonged or not in Washington State, in Walla Walla, here in World War II. Because after America came under attack in 1941 from the nation of Japan, Americans came to fear that which they did not know. And they did not know that 10,000 Japanese Americans across Washington State who lived on isolated farms and in urban ghettos, they become for them the other, the people they did not know and therefore came to suspect and fear. Not for anything they'd actually done, but because they all share the same race as those who were attacked at Pearl Harbor. They simply look like the enemy and share their race. And for that, they do not belong. And there are rumors in 1941 and some outright lies, like these from the Attorney General of California. But there's no evidence of espionage or sabotage, as he claims, on a mass scale. In fact, Earl Warren argues the lack of evidence of any espionage or sabotage on the part of Japanese Americans is proof that the Japanese in America are up to something, that they are planning an attack. So President Roosevelt caves in to pressure from Earl Warren, the West Coast congressman, to do something. And so he signs an executive order authorizing the removal of all 125,000 Japanese Americans from the West Coast. And to try to get around the obvious constitutional violations that are involved in that, the Army creates a military exclusion zone from which it can exclude all persons and then license back, as he says, everyone except those of the Japanese race. And you can see a little bit of California, that little dotted line there on the map on the wall. Here is the full view of the line drawn by the Army's Western Defense Command. I'm showing this to you, I'm going to great lengths to show this to you, to explain why the small number of Japanese Americans who settled in Walla Walla before the war were not removed. It's a handful of families in Walla Walla. And you can see this line runs down the center of Washington, Oregon, and California. So, with a little bit of Arizona at the bottom. So the Army gives itself the authority to remove all persons of Japanese ancestry from west of that line. And here in Washington State, going a little more granular, the line divides the state pretty much along the banks of the Columbia River. So you've got Seattle, Tacoma on the left side. And on the other side of the Columbia, you've got Pasco, Walla Walla, Moses Lake, and Spokane. And so people here on this side of the Columbia are not removed. However, there's an 8 p.m. curfew, 8 p.m. to 8 p.m. curfew placed on the families here in Walla Walla, and some grocery stores have to close because they can't operate the restaurants and hotels past 8 p.m. and they're forced to sell them for pennies on the dollar. So to be even more granular about this, I'm being fascinated by this. The description of the Army order follows State Highway 97 from the Canadian border down to the junction of the Columbia and Wenatchee rivers, jumps back and forth from bank to bank along the course of the Columbia down to Oregon. So again, everyone west of the line forced out of their homes, farms, and businesses into temporary assembly centers, 15 of them, close to the military line. And Bell is, of course, the hometown concentration camp for those in Seattle. And they're held in these camps for like 4 months while they await construction of 10 more permanent war relocation centers further inland in the high deserts of Idaho, Wyoming, and Utah and Arizona, two of the swamps in Arkansas. So you see the title of my presentation is, and my book is, resistance, Japanese American resistance to incarceration. And when I say camp resistance, that may conjure in your minds ideas of people throwing rocks at the soldiers, refusing orders at the point of bayonet, refusing to leave their homes at the point of bayonets. No, none of that happened. That's complete fantasy. The fact is, Japanese Americans all complied peacefully with Army orders and peacefully boarded the buses and the trains that took us to camp. This, in the top corner, a guy named Mike Masaoka, was of the Japanese American Citizens League. His exact words to me were, you want people murdered on the streets, you want tanks to come in and destroy the little ghettos that we have enjoyed. I think we had no alternative but to cooperate. So the story of camp resistance is one I've helped recover in my PBS documentary, as Stella mentioned, in 2000, and I'll show you a little bit about that later. And I continued with this graphic novel called We Hereby Refuse. And the stories I'll tell you tonight are those of those who contested not the initial eviction, but their prolonged incarceration after their removal. Through the example of these 3 young Americans, who all about your age actually, about your early 20s, who refused to submit to ongoing imprisonment without a fight. Jim Okutsu, about 21, he refused the draft at Minidoka, Idaho. Hiroshi Kashiwagi refuses government pressure to sign a loyalty oath at Tule Lake, California. And Mitsuya Endo refuses a chance to leave the camp at Topaz, Utah, so that her case could reach the U.S. Supreme Court. Taken together, this is kind of the story of camp as you've never seen it before. And that was very satisfying for us to do this because it's kind of not the typical victim narrative that my community like to present in public forums about, oh, how sad it was, how unjust, and so on. This is different. This is a story about people who pushed back against authority and who said they refused. Now, about the Supreme Court, you probably heard the names of Min Yasui, Frank Korematsu, Goran Hirabayashi, whose cases all did reach the U.S. Supreme Court. Min objected to the military curfew being applied only on the basis of race down in Portland. Fred in San Leandro, California, wanted to stay with his Italian-American fiancée, had eye surgery to disguise his Asian eyes, and still arrested. Gordon violating both the curfew and the exclusion order in Seattle at the UW as a matter of conscience. So these are names you know. But there was a fourth case to reach the Supreme Court, and until now, Mitsuya Endo was just a name on a court brief. We show you who she was as a person. She was a key punch operator in Sacramento for the state of California. After Pearl Harbor, the state suspends all employees of Japanese ancestry, say they can't be trusted. Endo joins a group of 63 Nisei state employees who organized to contest their incarceration, to contest their termination from their jobs. And they hired an attorney named James Purcell. But in the middle of their case, the Army evicts everyone, all Japanese Americans from the West Coast, from Sacramento, and Endo is bused to the Sacramento Assembly Center. Her removal enables the State Personnel Board to make a very tortured argument that it could now fire all of their Nisei state employees because they hadn't shown up for work, because they were all in camp, in prison camp. But they didn't show up for work, so they could be fired. James Purcell wants to bring a federal habeas corpus petition, but he wants to make the government prove their case, to produce the body. But he needs to find what he calls the perfect plaintiff. James Purcell, by the way, grew up in prison, and as the son of a guard at Folsom, he can relate to what's happening here. He says, I know a prison when I see one, and prison convicts get better housing than this. He goes shopping among his clients and chooses Endo because she doesn't speak Japanese or attend Japanese language school, and has a brother, in fact, in the U.S. Army. So she checks all the boxes as the perfect plaintiff for a case like this, and she shakes hands to signal her agreement. Lawyers for the government know that they're violating the principle of habeas corpus, which produce the body, and they send the chief solicitor to make a deal with her. So he offers her a chance to leave camp and go anywhere she wants, so long as it's not back to the West Coast. And of course, Endo, she wants her freedom. Who wouldn't? But if she leaves camp, that renders her habeas corpus case moot. So she can do what's best for herself, or she can do what's best for the good of all. As you can imagine, she does what's best for the law. It's a key decision point for her. I'm willing to go as far as I can in this case. And for her, it means staying in an incarceration camp for another 2 full years, so that her case can reach the U.S. Supreme Court, which rules the Roosevelt administration has no legal right to detain admittedly loyal U.S. citizens for an indeterminate amount of time. And this decision prompts the Army to revoke the West Coast exclusion zone that I showed you. And the War Relocation Authority announces it will now close the camps within a year. And so we get this never before seen of Endo dancing. When she gets the telegram about her Supreme Court victory, she does a little happy dance in her barrack with her friends. So, in brief, that's the story of Mitsuya Endo. Hiroshi Kashiwagi, second guy, also from Sacramento, refuses to answer a government loyalty oath in camp nearly a year after the mass removal, February 1943. Why does the government administer a loyalty questionnaire inside a concentration camp? It solves for them it solves the problems of two agencies, one military and one civilian. In 1943, many young men in camp, who were in these prison camps, restless, they say, I'm a loyal American, and I want a way to prove my loyalty. And the JCL, Mike Masaoka, is urging the government to let the Nisei volunteer for the Army in the fight against fascism to prove they're just as American as everyone else. The phrase was, spilling your blood for America. You probably heard a lot about the 442 and their valor, a much decorated unit. But the Army, having effectively branded the Japanese Americans as untrustworthy by locking them up, they now need a reverse PR campaign to clear these Nisei volunteers as eligible for service. I mean, how can you put, you lock them up for being disloyal one minute, and then how can you let them volunteer for the Army without some kind of process of clearing them, some kind of administrative process? At the same time, the War Relocation Authority, the people who created these camps, their mission is to eventually relocate, resettle families out of these concentration camps into homes and jobs in the East and Midwest. And they too need some way to cleanse or clear these people for resettlement. So the Army and WRA come up with what for them is a perfect paper trail, which is a loyalty oath, a paper questionnaire. And the Army and WRA combine their questions onto one form. The form is 28 questions in 2 sheets, double-sided. First one's very easy, name, address, names of your family members. Then a little more invasive, who are your relatives in Japan? Have you traveled overseas? Do you read or speak Japanese? Contributions you've made to organizations, relief agencies, magazines you've read. Finally, landing on these 2 questions at the end. Are you 27? Are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty or ever ordered? 28. Will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any and all attacks by foreign and domestic forces? And forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor. At the bottom, and it was also, by the way, fine print, giving false answers in this form subject to a fine of $10,000 or 10 years in prison. So people feel they have to answer this questionnaire. So I just want to stop and consider for a minute. Again, is a questionnaire or an oath really an effective way to root out potential spies and saboteurs from a given group? If I were a Japanese sleeper agent or burrowed on the West Coast for years before World War II, would I suddenly give myself up and say, oh my God, you caught me, yes, I'm a Japanese spy, yes, I'm loyal. No, of course not. Compounding this trickiness of this questionnaire is the larger context that the government is asking you to affirm your loyalty to the country after it has separated fathers from their families, after it's removed families from their homes, livelihoods, and freedoms. So the answers that people give are tainted by anger, by frustration, and by rage. And then he said, look, if you ask me these questions before taking everything away from me, and treating me like the enemy, which I'm not, I'd be happy to answer yes on this form. And further aggravating this kind of bureaucratic bungle is the fact that no one, not even the camp administrators, know the consequences of a yes or no answer. What happens if you answer no? No one knows. The Army sends recruiters to camp to recruit volunteers for the Army. Fails to give them an FAQ to deal with all the questions that hurl their way. If I answer yes to 27, am I automatically volunteering for the Army? Am I automatically enlisting? If I say yes to 28, to forswear allegiance to the Emperor, am I admitting that I was loyal to Japan before? And am I creating evidence against myself that can be used against me later on? In fact, they are. Hiroshi Kashiwagi has to answer this questionnaire like everyone else. And by this time, 1 year into the war and their imprisonment, he and many others are really fed up with the government continually demanding to prove his loyalty, and he refuses the pressure to sign the loyalty oath. His feeling is, I'm sick of saying yes to everything. Yes, I'll go to camp. Yes, I'll serve in the Army. Yes, I'll declare my loyalty. I'll prove my loyalty by standing for my rights as an American. Well, that's not the answer that the government wants. Hiroshi holds fast and refuses to fill out the form. So all this questionnaire accomplishes for him and 12,000 other people is to create an administrative class of people who, on paper, have to be categorized as not loyal because they did not answer the right answer on the questionnaire. So, like a good bureaucracy, all I can do is sort them into 2 piles: yes pile and no pile. And he's in the no pile, along with 12,000 others. Keeping in mind that he and 12,000 others have committed no acts of disloyalty in camp. All he's done is put down answers under threat of prison time and stiff fines on a poorly understood questionnaire for which no one has any idea the consequences. What really annoys me about this is that my own community, my own people, have vilified Hiroshi and others as the Nono Boys, the title of a novel in the lobby. Nono Boys, disloyals, pro-Japan, troublemakers, and And there, I mean, my community has been divided for 80 years over this very question. And it was like that kind of annoyance and frustration that led me to kind of get into this kind of story and kind of tease out all the complexities of this division, which, you know, my community bought into, and, you know, they called Hiroshi a no-no-boy troublemaker, and they shunned him and turned away from him. And yet, you know, I look at him and see, well, he did the only thing he could have done. Congress at this time pressures the War Relocation Authority to then segregate the no's from the yeses, because we don't want the bad apples, you know, making the whole barrel rot. And the WRA obliges Congress by fortifying one of its camps as a segregation center. And it chooses Tule Lake on the California-Oregon border as the segregation center. Moves in 12,000 from all the other 9 camps whose names are on the no pile, right? And 12,000 is like 1 of every 10 man, woman, and child who are in these camps, right? 10% refused to answer the questionnaire the right way. Still a minority, but still a significant mass resistance. Adding to the penal colony aspect of Tule Lake, government also builds a stockade, military stockade, to hold inmate leaders, kind of a prison inside a prison. This is, teasing this out for this graphic novel was the hardest thing I ever had to do, because, again, in my community, this is still to this day misunderstood. I'm going to leave the story here because this is just the first half of the Tule Lake story. There's a second half that goes into the mass hysteria that happens in the prison over questions of renouncing citizenship, you know, becoming even more rabid in your desire to perhaps repatriate to Japan or expatriate to Japan because there's nothing left for you in America. And that's a whole other story, which I'm going to have to just set aside because this is too much for this forum. Because I want to go on to a third form of resistance. And this is Hiroshi Kashiwagi in real life. I want to go on to the third form quickly of camp resistance, and that is resistance to the draft. And this occurs 1 year after that whole stuff about the questionnaire. Resistance to the drafting of young men in camp. And again, this is Hiroshi, Jim was 22. You're not much older than a lot of you in this room. So in January 1944, the War Department is so pleased with the record of the much decorated 442nd Regimental Combat Team, all for broke, that begins a program of military conscription of men who are being imprisoned in American concentration camps. And then he welcomed a chance to serve and, as I say, prove loyalty or spill your blood for America. And guys like Jim Akutsu and his brother Gene at the camp in Minidoka, Idaho, say, as Hiroshi did before, I've had enough. No, I'm not going to go. No to this draft. It's the last straw. At the camp at Hart Mountain, Wyoming, there was a different group calling itself the Fair Play Committee. And it organized informational meetings about the unconstitutionality of the draft and the underlying unconstitutionality of camp removal and incarceration itself. And I want to show you a key part of that film that I mentioned, Conscience and Constitution, about the Fair Play Committee. It's about 6 minutes long, and I'll just show it.
1944 marked the second winter in camp. On New Year's Day, they pounded rice into mochi cakes, just as if they were home. From overseas came word of heavy casualties among the first Nisei soldiers. The government announced it would now draft the young men in camp.
Well, as soon as I heard the news, or read the news, I was determined not to go.
What's right is right, what's wrong is wrong, and government is wrong.
For some, it was the last straw. At Heart Mountain, they organized, and Frank Abe would lead them. An engineer named Kiyoshi Okamoto had been writing manifestos calling himself the Fair Play Committee of One. He taught Abe about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. With Okamoto as chair, the Fair Play Committee typed bulletins, held meetings, and elected officers.
We collected $2 apiece from the Fair Play Committee members to set up a fund in case we had to have legal action.
Protests were raised at other camps, but they were unfocused and leaderless. These caught the eye of a journalist in the Free Zone of Denver.
They were spouting out about their loyalty to Japan and stuff like that. And I felt that they were taking the wrong approach because they weren't disloyal, but out of frustration were making these wild statements.
James Omura had publicly protested the mass incarceration. He said the JACL betrayed Japanese America by collaborating with the government. As editor of the Rocky Shimpo newspaper, his editorials fanned the growing resistance.
And I felt that someone should throw out what I felt was an anchor that these people could use that would be substantial.
The Nisei are well within their rights to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Beyond that,
We couldn't say directly anything that would be critical of the United States government policy. So we had to be oblique about it. I couldn't tell the people to organize, but in essence, I was telling them to organize.
Well, that really helped us morally because we felt that James Omura was in our corner. We've also felt that since this paper was being distributed in other camps, that it might stir up the other camps.
Guntaro Kubota, a Japanese language school teacher trained in the law, translated the Fair Play bulletins into Japanese.
I thought, gee, we have to fight for our rights. You know, that's all we know is this country. And so when my husband was asked to interpret what the Fair Play boys were saying, I thought, well, that's the only way they could make the money, raise the money, because they knew eventually they're going to court.
As the protest gained momentum, the first draft orders arrived in camp.
I was 18 here at Heart Mountain when the loyalty questionnaires came up. At that time, I didn't have any problem. I was apolitical. I was a white person. I wanted to be drafted. I wanted to serve my country.
The first group of draftees was told to report. When the day arrived, all 17 boarded the bus that took them to their pre-induction physicals. If the Fair Play Committee was to make a difference, it had to do more than protest. Some wavered.
I remember arguing that if we don't take a definite stand, it's not going to do any good.
At a packed mess hall rally, the Fair Play Committee crossed the line from protest to resistance.
we feel the present program of drafting us from this concentration camp is unjust, unconstitutional, and against all principles of civilized usage. Therefore, we members of the Fair Play Committee hereby refuse to go to the physical examination or to the induction, if or when we are called, in order to contest the issue. If ever there was a time or...
I didn't feel there was really a choice. We all had an obligation, a responsibility to publicize or to raise the issue of the incarceration, the evacuation at whatever opportunity we had. This certainly presented an opportunity, one that if we were to overlook it at this point, then we virtually accept the evacuation as a normal condition. I know my dad was 100% behind me. I had no real concern about him. My mother, on the other hand, like a normal mother, was concerned, and at one point even begged me to consider being like the rest of the guys and just go along and don't make waves.
Within a week, 5 young men refused to board the bus. The next week, 7 more failed to appear. The Fair Play Committee had a test case.
So that's the Fair Play Committee, Hart Mountain. The point Yosh makes at the end is very important. The draft resistance was not a protest against military service like it was for my generation in the Vietnam era. It was a protest against the camps itself. The last hook they could hang their hat on, to break the law, to bring a test case into court. So yes, they had a test case. When they get to court in Wyoming, the judge in their bench trial refuses to hear any constitutional arguments or moral arguments, rules strictly on the letter of the law. You fail to report for induction, doesn't matter your reason, they're all guilty, draft evasion. At Minidoka, where Jim Akutsu was, there was no organization. Jim and his brother Gene refused to report for induction on their own, taken to jail in Idaho, Boise, where they were tried for draft evasion. And just like the judge in Wyoming, the federal judge refuses to allow the jury to consider any constitutional issues. So the jury goes out, takes enough time to smoke a cigarette, comes back in, and to return verdicts of guilty. The same jury does this 33 times over in a bit of a kangaroo court situation. They're sentenced to 3 years and 3 months at McNeil Island Federal Penitentiary, south of Seattle. In the prison yard, the Minidoka resistors meet up with the Hart Mountain Fair Play Committee, with Gordon Hirabayashi, who's there also. He was also drafted after losing his Supreme Court case, and as a Quaker activist, Gordon refuses the draft as a conscientious objector, different reason. They form up 2 student baseball, sandlot baseball teams in prison. One's the resistors and one's the COs. Gordon's on the COs. So these are the 3 major forms of camp resistance. Refusing the questionnaire, refusing the draft, and taking a case to the Supreme Court. So taken together, this is the story of camp as you probably never heard it before. Were these folks celebrated for their principled stands by the Japanese American community? No, they were marginalized, and marginalized by those who control the narrative of the Japanese American community, principally the JACL, with whom I'm not very popular. Hiroshi Kashiwagi returns to Sacramento on a bright sunny day, only to find old friends in Tule Lake ignoring him, ostracizing him with the term "no-no boy" used as a slur. Again, it disturbs me how these terms, troublemaker, disloyal, pro-Japan, used in my community, by my community, without saying that these divisions were created not just by the war, but by the actions of the government, the U.S. government, to sort and label its incarcerees. And we, as a community, bought right into them. People just don't see that. I want to listen to Paul Tsuneishi here, who saw firsthand how the draft.
As I became more familiar with them and came to know some of them, I realized that they were in a position of being ostracized still after all these decades, and they would not voluntarily come out and say who they were. We had very few resistors and people of conscience, probably only 2 or 3 that would publicly surface at that time. And the rest of them are silent, some because their wives don't want to be brought out into the open.
And it wasn't just the wives. In Seattle, the mothers of those who served in the war turned on Jim Akutsu's mother for having 2 sons whom they call draft dodgers. They cut her off, tell her never to come to church anymore, don't come back. She was already a little bit on the edge already, so she cuts herself, rushed to Harborview Hospital. There she continues to spiral downward mentally. Here she's tying the string from her hospital gown around her neck and to her bedposts. She slumps over, and Jim finds her after she's taken her own life out of despair and social ostracism from the community. Let's see that. So, why is the story of wartime and mass incarceration so important? It goes back to the theme of the Donald Blake Center Academic Conference, race and belonging. Who decides who belongs and who does not belong, right? This story is important because we've seen the same fear of the other, the unknown, the same fear of the other that drove this wartime incarceration, 80 years ago. It continually resurfacing like clockwork whenever America feels itself threatened from abroad. In the 1980s, when imports of cars and consumer electronics from Japan stoke alarms of an economic Pearl Harbor. You're too young to remember this stuff, but an economic Pearl Harbor culminating in the beating death of Vincent Chin by 2 Detroit auto workers. You've heard that name. After 9/11, when the suicide bombing of the World Trade Center provokes the racial profiling of Muslims and Arab Americans, and anyone else who wears a turban. After the election of 2016, more recently, election of 2016 brings racial division and latent white nationalism to the very top of the American government, with a ban on travel from majority Muslim nations, family separations, and the caging of asylum seekers from Latin America on the southern border. You've seen that. And during a pandemic, even more recently, when the cries from an American president of China virus and Kung flu condones violence against Asian Americans that continues to this very day. We as Japanese Americans, never asked for any of this, Asian American, but having the experience in our families of exclusion and wartime racism gives us a certain moral authority when speaking about it, as I am to you today. And with that moral authority, I believe, comes the moral responsibility to stand in defense of others who are similarly targeted now, whether it's on the basis of their race, their religion, their immigration status, sexual orientation, and even more immediately, gender status, demonized, threatened. So I was pleased to see Japanese Americans rise to the challenge and halt the use of a facility at Fort Sill, Texas, a couple years ago, for the separation of families who are seeking asylum. And we can use the art of the graphic novel here to help us connect the past to the present and make sense of the present moment in some way. So, before I take questions, let me just close by reading to you from the last pages of the graphic novel. Here's Yoshi Kashiwagi, working in the 1970s as a librarian, describing how he fought for 10 years after Tule Lake. To get back to citizenship, he had mistakenly or erroneously or regretfully, he renounced his citizenship at Tule Lake. Fought for 10 years to get it back. And he says, after 35 years, 1970s, can you imagine my chagrin, my dismay, when I learned there was no law that required draft age Nisei to answer that loyalty questionnaire in camp? All those threats of prison and fines, all lies. I was angry all over again. At least I'm able to unburden myself with others who are cast out from my own community, even to this day. To be an American is a privilege I appreciate. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that America must unburden itself too. The government was wrong to single us out for exclusion based solely on our race. It was wrong then, and it would be wrong now. And whenever we see America turn against a people because of their race, or their religion, or their whatever, we won't just stand by. We won't just go along. I will speak out. I will see that every person gets a fair hearing. I will be the friend we didn't have when we needed one the most. It happened to us, and we refuse to let it happen again. Thank you very much.
So this time we are going to take some questions. Before we do that, let me just thank you for this presentation. I lived in Seattle for about 10 years and remember speaking with somebody who was a part of my community who lived on First Hill and was a child when her parents were taken from First Hill down to Puyallup. So hearing this additional information and hearing the stories presented in this graphic way really was enriching for me and challenging. So I'm sure the people here in this room may have some additional questions that they want to process. So just put your hand up and we will take as many as we're able. Yes.
Given that you've talked a lot tonight about the tensions within the Japanese community, especially that generation, so how has the book, given that it exposes many of those tensions, how has it been received by? I know it's a multifaceted community.
That's a very good question. I've missed any kind of backlash. I mean, I've not encountered it. One reason, sadly, is that the generation or the people who would have
are gone.
They're gone. Yeah. That generation has passed, and I miss them. I miss the friction and the arguments and we used to have, which actually is that as a bigger burden on me, because since they're gone, the argument can be made. Well, how can you say these things? They're not here to defend themselves, right? And so it makes us even doubly careful to present things fairly and responsibly, and because they're not here, Mike Lasso was not here to defend himself, but everything we put in the book is straight from his mouth and fairly contextualized. People have appreciated the connection from past to present, Even 20 years ago, when I did the film, and the folks are still alive, I never heard a peep from JCL or the Nisei vets, and I'd like to think it's because, as a journalist, we were thorough enough and fair enough, accurate enough, not to. I was scared as heck to, not to leave any mistakes in there they could attack us for. That was my worst fear. Bill Hisakawa would come after me for something I said, but no, it's all on the record. And it's just a different story, and I suppose it's generational. I mean, it was. I'm a child of the '60s. I grew up, in a time of social revolt and critical, criticism of our parents' generation. So, it's my generation is telling a story that's different from your family on First Hill, because that's a very simple story. Oh, I was Japanese, I was sent to this camp, it was terrible, food was bad, and I missed my friends in school. And that's one, the entry level of the story. And so we just ratcheted up all the way higher and higher. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yes, sir.
I kind of hesitate to ask this, but the issue of reparations certainly is tied to this.
Yes.
And do you want to speak about that a little bit, or is that?
Well, if another half hour, I can tell you the story of how, with Sean Wong's friend Frank Chin, we actually created. If you heard the term Day of Remembrance, the Day of Remembrance is observed every February 19th, and on the anniversary of President Roosevelt signing the Executive Order 966 that authorized the mass removal I described. And Frank Chin and I, in 1978, organized the very first Day of Remembrance in Seattle, which kind of kick-started the redress campaign in the nation. It was taken over by JCL and others, they carried the ball. But from 1978 to 1988, within a very short 10-year period, legislatively, a very short timeline politically, we turned the nation around from people like California Senator S.I. Hayakawa saying that reparations was unseemly of us to ask for, Wall Street Journal saying we were guilt-mongering, trafficking in human guilt, and we mobilized the Japanese American community to come out and tell the stories, these stories and others, and built a legislative record through a congressional commission, and just built a momentum over 10 years to get President Reagan to sign the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. But I like to think that Frank and I and others in Seattle helped turn around public opinion so that it wasn't just people trashing the idea, but actually showing that we could talk about the simple fact that the camps were wrong. It was wrong. It violated the Constitution, and the Constitution protects all of us. So this is an issue for all Americans, as we said, not just for us. It wasn't just about property losses. It was about the damage done to the U.S. Constitution and the precedent that's set for other groups who might face similar targeting based, again, on their race, religion, and immigration status. Yeah, I was very much a part of that, and we succeeded, and we thought that redress would be it, that would solve the problems of racial, racial segregation, not segregation, but I mean, the idea that you could lock up people based on their race or target people based on their race. Unfortunately, after 2016, we saw that, in fact, the latent, what I call white nationalism, white supremacy in America never went away. It was always there. It just went underground. And all it took was someone in the White House who could legitimize hate and fear and the same things that were virulent in World War II with anti-Japanese propaganda, anti-Asian propaganda. And so, we've seen that our democracy, as they say, is so fragile. It really depends on the people who are enforcing the law. People who are our institutions are very fragile. And so, having spent a decade, fighting for redress and getting it done was not enough. And it's a constant, continual, present-day struggle. Sorry, it's just not a very happy answer.
We have another question here.
Yeah.
My parents, who were born in the 1920s and grew up in Tacoma, and had Japanese American classmates, for example, at the Adventist High School in Auburn, told me that part of the justification, I'm not saying my parents were justifying it, but that part of the official line as to why Japanese Americans were sent to the camps was to protect them.
Oh, yes. Yeah, yes. And that's the question?
Well, I was just wondering if the documents you've researched support that position, that was part of the justification.
See, you're getting at something I wanted to get at earlier, which was when I grew up in the 50s and 60s, the prevailing notion before redress was that we were put in camps for our own protection, that we gained enormous benefits from being fed, housed, and being released to the East Midwest, where they got great education opportunities at Amherst and Wesleyan, and so on. The simple answer is, if we were there for our own protection, well, first of all, we didn't ask for protection. We didn't need protection. It was the job. It was the job of the police to protect us if there was any vigilante action. I worked for the King County Executive Ron Sims in 9/11. And Ron, bless his heart, after 9/11, we were all talking about locking up Islamic Arab Americans, and we all said, oh my God, it's World War II all over again. It's incarceration all over again. They're talking about Arab American roundup. And Ron Sims got up, we did a press conference organized, and he said, I'm the county executive, and this is the sheriff, and if anyone, starts to do vigilante actions against our Islamic or Arab American brothers and sisters, we'll protect them. We'll mobilize the sheriff to get out there and protect people, protect the mosques, right? And that's all it took. So no, the simple answer to your question is about protection was, why were then the machine guns pointed inside and not out?
Right, but what I'm trying to ask is, was part of the propaganda to justify it, claiming that it was to protect Japanese Americans.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, well, that came post-war.
Okay.
That argument, because at the time, the only argument was, I'll stand over here. Stay in the camera. At the time, the only argument was fear of espionage and sabotage, and that the Washington Defense Command felt they had a military necessity. There was a military need, which you can't argue against the Army, right? The Army says there's a military need to protect the Boeing plant, you know, in the Green River Valley, and you know, farms, you know, and so on. In fact, the FBI, we now know, had no evidence of any. They investigated. J. Edgar Hoover investigated everything, and he was one of those who said, "There's no need for this. You don't need to do this." And in 1983, some folks in the National Archives found the original copy of General DeWitt's final report, which showed that he covered up the real reason was racism. It was, as he put it very colorfully in testimony to Congress, a Jap's a Jap, and you can't change their essential nature. Is they're, you know, regardless of where they were born, I don't trust them. You know, blood is thicker than water, if you will. And that was his reasoning for this mass removal. But he claimed it was a military need, and there was no military need. And so in the redress campaign, there was a congressional commission, did a study, a report, came out with the 3 official reasons now for these events of 1942, and they were racism, racial prejudice, wartime hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. Those are the 3 official documented now reasons for why this happened. Not because the Army needed us off the coast to protect the Boeing plant, because no one was sabotaging the Boeing plant. Yeah. Long answer. Yeah. Yes.
Hi. Okay. So just taking in all this information and then reading the graphic right there, it says like, "I will be the friend we didn't have when we needed the most."
Yeah.
So like, what can people here like tonight do to like better spread the word, like better just to like rewrite the wrongs necessarily, or just to push forward this narrative? What would you have people do to advocate?
If you see someone being harassed on a bus because of their gender status, right? I mean, if they're, you know, or their transgender status perhaps, or their race, or because they're wearing a turban or a hijab. Don't just sit there. You know, I mean, you can stand. You can find. There are techniques. I don't go into them now. There are techniques you can use to defuse the situation personally and without putting yourself at risk. The thing you can do is to learn to stand with others as allies. And this is what the reason for putting this in the last page is, I kept talking about the election of 2016. You know, we always said this will never happen again, never again. You know, and then in 2016 we saw, oh my God, it is happening again. And so, you know, it went from never again to never again is now. Very dispiriting idea, but so never again is now, and that's the actual that's actual photo based on a photograph that actually happened at to the pilgrimage. So. Yeah, just is not wherever an opportunity presents itself to take a stand, be an ally, speak up, and you know, don't let it happen, because it happens very slowly, you know, and by increments. And so you have to really be very clear and stand up before things get out of hand. Yeah.
Let's take 2 more questions and then we'll wrap up. I see Curtis, you have your hand, and then we'll take you as the last question. Thank you.
Do you know if anyone from the 442nd Battalion was awarded for their bravery?
Oh, scores of them, yes. Silver Stars, Purple Hearts, federal courthouses named after them in Seattle. Daniel Noe, you know, Presidential Medal of Freedom. I'm sure we have those guys. Yeah, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the segregated Nisei Battalion, is the most decorated, you know, military unit in Army history. But there's a reason for that. Chet Tanaka told me every time someone would stub their toe, or we would say, write it up, because they wanted to get as many Purple Hearts as they could, documented. You stub your toe, write it up. And we wrote so many, injuries because they wanted to get those numbers up. Because they went into this with the objective, with the goal of having the most battlefield casualties, or at least have the reputation of being brave, and that was one metric. So yeah, there were many reward citations up the ante. Yeah. I'm the anti-442, if you will. So this my story is a little peep in the continuum of Japanese American storytelling. This is different.
Okay, we'll have our final question before we conclude.
So my question is about the actual book itself and the structure and your choices around narrative and visuals. It's an unusual in many ways in that there's various styles and you're telling multiple stories. Do you want to talk a little bit about your decisions around that and what you were hoping to convey to readers?
Doing a graphic novel was never on my radar. I'm not a graphic novelist. I'm a storyteller, a journalist, and writer. But the Wing-Look Museum of Seattle had a commission, call for proposals. I answered it because it was my subject area. And they gave us 2 artists and another writer. And so we spent 6 years doing the story. And this committee in the Wing-Look Museum had this brilliant idea, we'll have 2 artists, and that'll divide up the work. And I imagine they thought that we would have one artist do one character and do 1 character per chapter. And I said, no, we're going to tell one story, several stories, continually in a common timeline. So the storytelling is start to finish one timeline with characters continuing to follow the stories in sequence, like a movie with 3 characters. And we didn't know how it would work to have different artists doing different parts of the book. Fortunately, people seem to accept it and it worked out. But that was the narrative choice we made, was to, and the other was, every scene is there to show people pushing against authority, pushing back against the circumstances, pushing back against the government, and pushing back against JCL. And so there's a tension in the graphic novel that is below the surface, but that's how it's generated, was by always pushing back resistance. Right? It's friction. It's resistance pushing back against the government and secondarily against JCL. So that's the secret of the story.
Thank you.
Would you join me in thanking Frank for being with us this evening? Well, thank you again for being with us, and we wish you well for the rest of your evening.
Great audience.